Hello and welcome to this special birthday edition of Louis Bertou's Music Reviews. Today I'm reviewing the weird and wonderful Slint Spiderland. Apparently Spiderland has just turned 30 this year. The record made by kids, for kids, finally grew up, you could say. So I figured, now is as good a time as any to offer my personal thoughts on the album, especially as this record, it's meant a lot to me over the years, and it was really one of the first experimental rock albums I actually got into. I listened to it first back in sort of, about 8 years ago actually, and considering I'm in my, 20s now, I definitely got into this record quite young, and I'm glad I did, It's meant that it's really established itself as a cornerstone of my listening. It's one of those albums that I'm always a little bit surprised at how it has managed to amass such a following over the years. It certainly deserves it, but it just surprises me, It doesn't seem like the kind of album that would be so popular, but go figure. But yeah, it definitely deserves the hype, I think, especially given how back in the 90s when it was released in 1991, it didn't really get the reception I don't think it deserved, It was quite a flat reception, I believe. Obviously, if you knew, you knew. If you were actually there with them, you would have realised how great this album is. But it took the general public, several years to actually catch on to how unique and exciting the sounds were on Slint's Spiderland. On this record here, I feel the driving forces are Britt Walford, the drummer, and then Brian McMahon, the singer and sort of, I guess, arranger of the music as well. And essentially, the band would, under instruction by Britt Walford, play these riffs to the point where they were as easy as breathing, and sort of just keep playing them, keep practicing them until they didn't have to, consider the parts at all. They were just, like I say, easy as breathing. Then McMahon, the singer, would sort of rearrange these riffs, these really great riffs, into something even greater than the sum of their parts. Into these sort of, post-rock progressive monoliths such as Washer, or especially Good Morning Captain. And the band had already begun to experiment with longer forms on their previous record, Tweeze. Like some of the songs there sort of exceed the 5-minute mark. However, on Spiderland here, no song is less than 5 minutes, and it's essentially 6 fairly long tracks. I think the longest track is over 8 minutes, so pretty progressive forms, songwriting forms. I personally have a soft spot for the band's first album, Tweeze. I think it's a great sort of blend of energy and riffs, while also sort of really not taking itself too seriously. And it seems like, quite a good reflection of the band at this point. However, I must say, on Spiderland, I feel like the band upped the game in nearly every respect. Both in the sense of longer forms and more complex arrangements that I mentioned before, as well as just the sound, I think. I think everything's a lot clearer and more defined on this record, as opposed to, say, Tweeze, which, is pretty muddy sounding at best. So, the record begins with Breadcrumb Trail, track 1. And from, that fateful day in 2013 when I did press play on this album, sort of totally on a whim, just sort of based on the look of the cover, really. Those first few seconds really did just make me sit up and take notice. I kind of remember feeling like this is it, this is what I've been searching for. This is kind of what I've been looking for this whole time in music. It just sounded very exciting, there's a lot of promise, I think, from those first few seconds. And it makes me think of an album like Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures, which sort of it also, in its first few seconds, manages to really capture a time and a place and just really set up the record in a very exciting way. Spiderland's opener then continues to chug along on the same riff it had established in the first few seconds. And then you also get some lyrics, which, to be honest, they do sound a bit like one of the band members kind of reciting a dream that they had last night. You've kind of got this quite simplistic story of somebody going to a fairground and meeting a fortune teller and sort of going through a lot of the rides. There's some story development in the middle when apparently the owner of the merry-go-round or something doesn't let them off, and there's like an antagonist is brought up, but on the whole, quite simple lyrics here. And yeah, the the song kind of functions on a rough, almost A-B-A structure. It sort of starts off with the initial riff. There's a lengthy B section, which is a lot heavier, I'd say, and then the A section returns at the end. And it's a very simple structure. It's an odd one, I think, to use in a rock song, but the band get a lot out of it. There's a lot of scope there, I think. By comparison, the second track, Nosferatu Man, is a lot more of just a straight-ahead rocker. And these days, while I have heard rock music that definitely reaches further and is more exciting, back in the day this would have blown my head off, sort of little me, not really experienced experimental rock, not really heard, This Heat or The Swans, this would have blown my head off, certainly, like I say. But to be honest, these days the only moments that really move me are the ones where Brian McMahon is sort of yelling his head off, sort of in the choruses, I think they are, but yeah. Nosferatu Man, not necessarily a highlight, but it chugs along, it sounds decent. Then on Don Aman, this is kind of where I think Spiderland establishes itself as more of a post-rock album. You can see where people have drawn that comparison with later bands like Godspeed You, Black Emperor, and these kind of bands where you can definitely hear they've taken sound from this record here. And yeah, arrangement-wise, this is possibly the most striking track so far. It's basically just two guitars and a sort of spoken vocals over the top of it. It's a very quiet song, which is interesting, because it's using rock music instruments, or rather typical rock music instruments, but in this quiet way, which is very typical of the post-rock genre. While I don't necessarily rate Slint's lyrics on this album, sorry, I just don't. Sometimes they do come off as slightly juvenile, and not necessarily in a good way either. But there's especially some lines on this song that seem to sort of detail like social anxiety and isolation, which just always come off as really genuine and authentic. And I think it shows a side of the band which is relatable to any young person. I think especially myself as a listener back when I was sort of 15 or even 18. Hell, even now, I struggle with a bit of that social isolation, but, don't we all? These days, anyway, in the pandemic. A line such as, like swimming underwater in the darkness, for me, it sounds simple, it's very straight to the point, but it really encapsulates, for me, an image I had, as a kid. It's going to sound silly, but I used to imagine this elevator, this lift, kind of travelling in the ocean, plummeting right down to the depths of the ocean until it becomes, basically too dark to see. And it was an image that made me feel isolated, and it creeped me out, but it was also very peaceful and, airless, like no sounds happened at all. And I'd say lines like this one, like swimming underwater in the darkness, I mean, even though they're simple, they sort of tap into that same energy that same imagery that I had as a younger person. Later on in the song, one of the guitarists stamps on the distortion pedal, and we're away again. So that wraps up my thoughts on side 1, or side A of this record. And I'd say side B is even better. So, prepare yourselves. The track Washer, for me, is superbly composed. I think it's really Brian McMahon at his best. He really was the driving force, I think, behind the composition of this song. And while each of the individual parts are lovely and wonderful on their own, they all sort of, when they're put together in this specific order, they really make something greater than the sum of their parts, and that song is Washer. Obviously, the vocals, people often talk of the vocals on this song, and they're certainly disarming at first, but I've found myself, over the years, I've kind of accepted the authenticity and vulnerability that they portray on this song, and I think it's, they're not good, but they're fitting, I think. No other, if they got a vocalist on there that actually could sing, I don't think the lyrics would transmute the same way that they do here. For me, I think the quintessential post-rock sound is held on this record here, and that is the instrumental For Dinner. That song really encapsulates, I think, the quietness of post-rock and the repurposing of rock music instruments for creating more of an ambient experience. And I mentioned in my review of Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, that there's a particular cadence in that piece which reminds me of a Dali painting where you sort of get I think it's Christ on the cross sort of floating through the sky, and I get that same sort of image. I think it applies to this song as well, especially near the end during that one riff where it just feels like everything's floating. It feels like everything's floating up. Like For Dinner, for the most part, it's quite dark sounding and often enhances rumbles on the low toms and low rumbling bass chords. But I think in those in that last minute when you get that nice floaty riff, it does just, it feels like we're drifting away, much like that Dali painting I mentioned before. I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of that Dali painting, I'm sure, over these next reviews. This is a highlight for me, even though it might not be in my top 3 tracks on the album. It's certainly, even though it feels like background music, it's very necessary between the two sort of highlights, Washer and Good Morning Captain. We need that kind of breathing space, I think, especially, to brace ourselves for the total storm that is Good Morning Captain. Yeah, the closing track on Spiderland, Good Morning Captain, is a masterpiece, and I don't say that lightly. There's nothing else like it. It combines like the dissonances of metal, whereas the whole thing is almost constructed in like a modern sort of classical way. Like the whole thing could function if you wrote out all the different parts, like a modern classical piece. And then there's that groove, which kind of goes against those two genres I mentioned there. Just the groove. I'd say it's sexy sounding, and yes, sexy. That's the word I'm going to use there, because it's such a great groove, and the band really, they know it. They keep playing it, and it doesn't get tiring. If anything, the tension is built further through the repeats of that riff. And then, of course, you've got the sound of the song, which brings it back to the sort of post-hardcore genre that this record is firmly established in. But yeah, like I say, there's other styles here. There's other styles at play. It's not just your average post-hardcore song. Certainly not. This is certainly a song that demands you listen all the way through. And I feel like it's almost a rite of passage of any music listener to really spend some time with this song and really let it sink in. I think one of the reasons why it is such a great song is the wonderful balancing of tension and release. Like, you have the first riff that really comes in on this song, the introductory riff is definitely tense. It's the one I mentioned earlier as being, incredibly groovy, but it's groovy and uncertain, like you're kind of dancing, but you might get shot, that kind of thing. And that sort of spiky groove is contrasted by these 3 heavier sections which come in interspersed at 3 points during the song, and the final one of those is really the true release, I think, of this album, and certainly the dynamic peak of the record as a whole, as well as being just one of the greatest outros to any rock music album ever, I think. Like that, I'm talking about the final heavy section, that I Miss You section. I think it's quite timeless, and yeah, it's emotional as well. Like, you really do feel it when you hear Brian McMahon shout those words, because up until that point, I think his vocal delivery has been almost spoken, and, well, definitely spoken, and really to hear him suddenly go from spoken to shouting it's very jarring and very, cathartic and emotional. So besides the great balance of tension and release, as well as that great cathartic outro, one of my favourite moments on this album, and indeed music in general, is that point, I've written it down here, 4 minutes 17 to 4 minutes 45. It's just the way that heavy section, I think it's the second time that heavy section plays, and it gets swept away very, very abruptly, and then suddenly you're left with just these 2 guitars, one of them playing a 2-chord sequence, very, very simple, then the other one simply playing semiquavers on 1 string. And it's so light and airy in comparison to the heavy section we've had before, and it just feels like it's the perfect blend between beauty but then also just blunt simplicity. Like, these guitar parts are not complex, and that's one of the reasons why this moment is so great, I think. It's like a crack of light. It truly is. And I really do get that. It's a strong image from listening to this little bit of music here. This sort of moment at 4:17, if you want to, bring up the album and get that point. Because truly, I think it's one of the greatest musical moments ever. And then, of course, after that light, airy, simple guitar part, we get the riff coming back in again. And that's just like, it feels like a physical gut punch when that riff comes back in. And a good one, obviously, you know. It's one of the most satisfying moments on the album, I think, when that riff does get reincorporated. Yeah, it sounds silly, but I'm proud of Slint for recording this song. Like, this is an achievement. This is a towering achievement, I think. And I'm so glad that they managed to get it down on recording and that it, you know, survived this long for me to be able to hear it in 2013, and then obviously in 2021 as well, in order to review this album. So yeah, thanks, Slint. And for this song, as well as the story behind the record, how unique and exciting the sound is on this album, as well as the personal attachment, this album gets a strong 9 out of 10 for me. Obviously, at one point it would have been a straight up 10 out of 10, but, you know, I've changed. My listening habits have changed, and for now it is a strong 9 out of 10.